Hello fellow YouTubers. Today I'm going to talk about H P Lovecraft and my love for his work. And if you're familiar with the content on my YouTube channel, you'll know that I have a fair amount of videos based on his stories or inspired by them. I think I have made about 9 or maybe 10 Lovecraftian films, and I have at least 7 or 8 new ones in my plans. But let's start off with talking about the guy himself. If you're not at all familiar with Lovecraft, who was he and why should you care about who he was? Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, where he spent most of his life. His mom, Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, could trace her ancestry back to New England's colonial period. She apparently thought her son was terribly ugly and used to dress him up in girls' clothes when he was very young. His dad, Winfield Scott Lovecraft, went mad after attracting syphilis and was locked away in an asylum when HPL was only 3 years old. But his maternal granddad, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, kind of stepped in and became Lovecraft's father figure. Granddad Whipple was wealthy and had a huge house and a big library. It was here that Lovecraft read fairy tales like the Arabian Nights, various ghost and horror stories, but also delved into science, which became a great love for him. According to Lovecraft himself, he had a wonderful childhood living with Grandpa Whipple and his mom. It was during this period he invented an exotic alter ego, the mad Arab sorcerer Abdul al-Hasred, and we'll get back to him later. But after some bad business decisions, the family fortune went to heck. His granddad died, and Lovecraft and his mom was forced to move to a smaller house and leave most of their things, including Grandpa's library, behind them. Apparently Lovecraft was so severely struck by this upheaval that he contemplated suicide. He continued to have nervous problems, making his school years almost impossible. Eventually his mom was also interned in the same institution as his dad and died there. Lovecraft continued living with a couple of his aunts. By this time he had started writing poetry and short stories and found an outlet for them in the amateur press. He eventually met another amateur writer, Sonia Green, married her, and moved to New York. Lovecraft hated the big city with every fiber of his being, and after a few years he divorced Sonia and moved back to Providence. And here's where his greatest creative period started. It's when he wrote his best-known tales. By this time Lovecraft was being published in various weird fiction magazines, and he had made a number of friends among his fellow writers of horror and sci-fi. The most important and famous of those were Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith. Unfortunately, Lovecraft never achieved real financial security or widespread fame, and actually lived his last years in poverty. After complications from cancer, he passed away in 1937. So why are we still talking about Lovecraft today when he wasn't a very famous or successful writer? Well, his friend and admirer, you could say disciple, August Derleth, started the publishing company Arkham House with the sole intent of gathering Lovecraft's writings and publishing them as books. Eventually, other writers also got published by Arkham House. Some of them wrote in the style of Lovecraft, others had their own themes. But gradually, Lovecraft's fame grew among his fans, and all sorts of artists, writers, and musicians were inspired by his stories and the atmosphere in them. Now, Lovecraft has become something of a pop culture icon himself, due to his various quirks and interests. He loved cats, beans, and ice cream. He preferred to dress in older styles of clothing and was obsessed with books and period architecture. And to take an example of how his work has been adopted by a wider audience, his most famous creation, the evil extraterrestrial demigod Cthulhu, has been reincarnated as toys, plushies, memes, clothing, and general geek silliness. Let's get into what Lovecraft actually wrote about. In essence, the premise of Lovecraft's cosmic horror is that the narrator of the story gradually finds proof that our world was eons ago visited by extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings of such evil and power that the worst atrocities of mankind pale before them. Some of these abominations are still here, slumbering in sunken cities at the bottom of the ocean, or under the pyramids, or in the ice of Antarctica. Some lurk just beyond our perception of reality, waiting for a recklessly curious human to call them forth using what we term magic. Sometimes the protagonist actually comes in contact with one of these beings and is driven almost mad from the experience. There are statues, temples, and above all forbidden books of knowledge where the protagonist can partake in horrible revelations. Specifically, the ancient tome the Necronomicon, written by Lovecraft's childhood alter ego Abdul al-Hazred, is a recurring thread in the tales. In Lovecraft stories, man and our civilization is a joke. We mean nothing to the vast universe, nor does our accomplishments or our hopes and dreams. Man's religions are useless humbug, and our science, though enthusiastically employed, cannot save us either. Our curiosity can actually become our downfall. Emperor Ming, in the fabulous 1980 movie Flash Gordon, actually sums up Lovecraft's concept of horror perfectly when, in the film, he says, "Pathetic earthlings, hurling your bodies out into the void without the slightest inkling of who or what is out here. If you had known anything about the true nature of the universe, anything at all, you would have hidden from it in terror." Lovecraft also seemed slightly obsessed with another theme, and that was degenerate family bloodlines. One of his protagonists may find out that he's actually related to fish, frog, sea monsters, and that he'll eventually turn into one himself. Or he might discover that his great-great-grandfather had sex with a white gorilla. Or he may encounter a wealthy ancient family that turned to cannibalism and changed into ape-like subterranean dwellers. I'm sure the unhappy fates of Lovecraft's parents had something to do with this, and he must have thought, this is hereditary. When will it be my turn? Lovecraft also had a very special writing style. He loved antiquated spelling and frequently used cumbersome adjectives as descriptions. Abominable, gibbous, cyclopean, eldritch, unnameable. All of these quaint ideas and mannerisms have now become rather cherished among horror enthusiasts, and a new adjective has been invented to sum it all up. Lovecraftian. I first encountered Lovecraft when I was around 12 or 13 years old, which I think is a perfect age to get hooked by Lovecraft, at least if you're a boy. At my local library, I found 2 books titled Cthulhu 1 and Cthulhu 2, and yes, I know, the titles are misspelled. They were collections of his best-known stories translated into Swedish and published by sci-fi author Sam Lundvall, who also provided some info about Lovecraft in his preface. The very first story I read was the Dunwich Horror, and it made a huge impression on me. It's still my favorite story by Lovecraft, and I devoured the rest of the tales, instantly getting Lovecraft's concept of horror. This was horror for atheists, not drawing from the paraphernalia of traditional Gothic horror, but still retaining the mood and atmosphere of Gothic horror. Let me explain that a little bit further. Traditional supernatural Gothic horror is about ghosts, vampires, werewolves, and other entities and persons touched by curses or being the result of sin or hereditary sin, witchcraft, and other dealings with Satan and his minions. It's basically all about the Christian or Abrahamitic perception of evil. Without the basic ideas of heaven and hell, damnation and salvation, this particular very traditional brand of horror would not exist. Lovecraft himself was an atheist, and even in his very early tales, which were, I think, quite clearly influenced by Poe, even though they have retained this kind of Gothic feel, the absence of stock props and characters from Christian horror, as I call it, is quite significant. I have been an atheist all my life, and I really appreciated Lovecraft's tales being based in science, although they were often very preposterous tales. Whether it touched upon the evolution of man, the geological history of our planet, or the universe with its known and unknown worlds. The horror in Lovecraft stories comes from, as I said, the littleness of man compared to the vastness and mystery of the universe. But it's also about the vastness of time, specifically our time, on this planet. In the end, the age of man will most probably only be a tiny footnote in the whole history of our world. The ego of the human race has been boosted beyond all validity by our religions, but also by science. And Lovecraft points out that we actually know nothing, and that because of the cultural baggage that we always carry with us, our ignorance may in fact be a blessing. At the beginning of the Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft writes, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." Makes you feel warm and fuzzy all over, doesn't it? So how have old Lovecraft fared in cinematic history then? Well, there aren't actually that many movies made based on his stories, and those made have usually strayed from the source material in various ways. I believe the first Lovecraftian movie adaptation is The Haunted Palace from 1963. And if you know your stuff, then yes, you're right in that that's not the title of any Lovecraft story, but the title of a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. And that's because it's based on the Lovecraft tale The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, but it was dragged into the Roger Corman AIP series of Poe movie adaptations to flesh that out, and had a Poe title slapped onto it. It's not a bad horror movie, but as a Lovecraft adaptation, it's kind of lackluster. And that also goes for the later AIP Lovecraft films Die, Monster, Die, based on The Color Out of Space, and the Dunwich Horror, based on, well, the Dunwich Horror. There was a short resurgence of Lovecraftian cinema in the 1980s when Stuart Gordon adapted Herbert West's Reanimator and From Beyond as two successful movies. But after that, Hollywood's interest in Lovecraft seems to have fizzled out. Despite this, Gordon has continued adapting Lovecraft, and there have been other valiant efforts both on film and on television. Director Guillermo del Toro has been trying for years to get his version of At the Mountains of Madness off the ground, with little success. And it's actually the amateur or independent filmmakers who have given Lovecraft the most respectful treatment. So why did I start making my own Lovecraftian videos? Well, as I first read these stories and was hooked by the mood and the atmosphere in them, I realized that I probably wasn't going to be able to transfer those qualities to film, but whatever I ended up with would be vastly more entertaining and interesting than the usual homemade vampire or zombie film. And here's what I consider being my contribution to Lovecraftian cinema. Though other people might not agree with me, I knew that my passion for stop-motion puppet making and animation would allow me to show those more outlandish creatures in the stories, and thus be able to adapt the stories themselves, of course. When I started looking around at my amateur filmmaking peers, I saw that they were pretty much adapting the same stories over and over, and those were the stories that never really showed the horror, stories that relied basically on suggestion and atmosphere. And I have to point out, those two qualities are, besides a capable script, the most important ones in a horror movie. But I decided to go in the opposite direction and use Lovecraft's tales to create spectacle in the vein of King Kong or Ray Harryhausen's creature features. But hopefully there is some mood and creepiness in there too. In the early 2000s I had a friend who was equally into Lovecraft, and we decided to adapt one of Lovecraft's stories, but we couldn't agree on what story, so we made up our own thing, an amalgam of Lovecraftian themes such as the abandoned house, the forbidden book of knowledge, the tentacle horror, and the narrator being incarcerated in an asylum. We shot the whole thing, called The Eye of Evil, with an analog consumer video camera, and as you can see my current transfer from tape to digital format looks rather dreadful. We filmed at a derelict cottage, used the pigsty at my grandmom's farm as a black magic den, and a closed down slaughterhouse as the asylum cell. I built a decomposed corpse out of papier-mâché and a stop-motion puppet for the tentacled horror. This is a silly film, but it whetted my appetite to do more, and I have continued exploring Lovecraft in my videos for the past 15 years or so. I'm sure that enjoying my Lovecraftian adaptations is a matter of very personal tastes. Some Lovecraft enthusiasts love them, others hate them. And sometimes I'm asked, why don't you send your films off to a Lovecraft film festival? And I actually have. I've sent 2 of them to Lovecraft film festivals. And they made no impact whatsoever, either way. The reaction was really just a big meh. So instead I choose to share my films directly with the YouTube audience. And I think that your judgment of my work will be, for me, just as valuable and valid as that of any film festival jury. There is one big elephant in the room with Lovecraft, and that is his racism. His black people are often simian, and his Asians are slant-eyed. When you take Lovecraft and put him up against other titans of horror, such as, for example, Stephen King or Clive Barker, he will stand out as a sore thumb because of this. But people seem to forget that Lovecraft is not of our age. He adapted the prevailing attitudes among white people when he grew up, and I should point out the prevailing attitudes of privileged, well-to-do white people. If you read literature from the late 19th century and early 20th century, you will find racist attitudes everywhere, some more pronounced than others. To conclude this rather long ramble, I will keep coming back to Lovecraft in my film projects, because I think there are endless visual possibilities in adapting his stories. And I should also mention that I am actually currently adapting a story by his friend Clark Ashton Smith. And I would like to tackle material from his other weird fiction buddy Robert E. Howard sometime further down the line. So thanks for watching this vlog. I hope you enjoyed it. And please consider subscribing and supporting my films at Patreon, where you will get some very cool monthly rewards. And may Cthulhu bless you and your degenerate kin.